As the winter months of early 1945 drew near their close, the vast military conflict stretching across the Pacific Ocean had reached what many would consider its most critical and decisive phase. The archipelago known as the Philippines, which had once served as a colonial possession under American governance, now represented something far more complex than mere territory on a strategic map. This collection of islands held a significance that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. On one hand, there existed the deeply symbolic and emotional connection, a matter of national pride and honor that could not be easily quantified or dismissed. On the other hand, the islands possessed undeniable military value, their harbors and landing strips representing essential infrastructure that would prove absolutely vital for any future military operations directed toward the Japanese home islands themselves. The man most intimately connected with the Philippines in the American military consciousness was General Douglas MacArthur, a figure whose personal history had become inextricably intertwined with the fate of these islands. 3 years earlier, in the dark days of 1942, MacArthur had been compelled to abandon the Philippines in the face of overwhelming Japanese military pressure. Before his departure, he had made a promise that would echo through the following years of brutal warfare. He had vowed, with characteristic determination, that he would return. Now, as American forces prepared to make good on that promise, MacArthur found himself driven by multiple imperatives. The liberation of Manila, the Philippine capital, had become an obsession for him. Speed was paramount in his calculations. Within the city, thousands of prisoners languished in Japanese captivity, their lives hanging in precarious balance. Every day of delay potentially meant more deaths, more suffering. Beyond the humanitarian concerns, there existed political considerations as well. The Philippine government, forced into exile by the Japanese occupation, needed its legitimacy restored, and nothing would accomplish that more effectively than the swift recapture of the nation's capital city. Yet within the upper echelons of American military command, unanimity proved elusive. General Walter Kruger, who commanded the substantial 6th Army forces, viewed the situation through a different tactical lens. His approach favored caution and consolidation. The American landing at Lingayen Gulf had established a beachhead on Luzon, the main Philippine island, but Kruger worried about what military planners call the operational rear. Japanese forces remained scattered throughout the mountainous interior regions, and Kruger feared that a hasty advance toward Manila might leave American supply lines vulnerable to attacks from these mountain strongholds. Better, in his estimation, to take time to secure the surrounding territory, to build up overwhelming force, and then to advance with absolute confidence in one's logistics and communications. MacArthur, however, possessed neither the patience nor the inclination to accept such delays. Every hour that passed, he argued, gave the Japanese defenders more time to prepare Manila's destruction. They might choose to declare it an open city, as the Americans themselves had done when retreating in 1942, thus sparing it from devastation. But if the Japanese decided instead to fight, every additional day of preparation would make the eventual battle more costly in both American lives and Philippine civilian casualties. The infrastructure of the city, its historical buildings, its churches and schools and government edifices, all hung in the balance. MacArthur issued his orders with characteristic firmness. The advance would proceed immediately, with all available speed. The risk to the rear areas would have to be accepted and managed as the campaign developed. On the Japanese side of this unfolding drama, the situation proved equally complicated by disagreements and divided command structures. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, who bore overall responsibility for the defense of the Philippines, had analyzed the military realities with cold professional clarity. Manila, he understood, could not be successfully defended against the overwhelming American advantages in firepower, logistics, and material resources. To attempt such a defense would constitute nothing less than suicide for the forces involved. Yamashita's strategic vision called for a different approach entirely. He intended to abandon Manila without a fight, withdrawing his forces into the mountainous terrain of northern Luzon. There, using the advantages provided by difficult terrain and interior lines of communication, Japanese forces could wage a prolonged guerrilla campaign. They might not ultimately win, but they could tie down American forces for months or even years, delaying the inevitable assault on Japan itself. This strategy required that all Japanese forces in the Manila area, including naval personnel, be placed under the unified command of General Shizuo Yokoyama, who led the formation known as the Shimbu Group. Yamashita's orders were clear. Evacuate Manila. Preserve the army for the mountain campaign ahead. But the Japanese military command structure contained fault lines that would prove catastrophic. The Navy, with its own chain of command and its own institutional pride, did not necessarily feel bound by army directives. Vice Admiral Denshiji Okochi saw the situation differently than Yamashita. When he learned of the orders to evacuate Manila, he issued counter-instructions to Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi, who commanded what was designated as the Manila Naval Defense Force. Okochi's logic contained both practical and emotional components. The naval installations in Manila represented valuable assets that should not simply be abandoned without a fight. More than that, the Navy had suffered humiliations that demanded vengeance. The battleship Kirishima had been lost at Guadalcanal, a defeat that still stung. The opportunity to inflict casualties on the Americans, to make them pay dearly for every yard of Manila's streets, appealed to the warrior ethos that dominated Japanese naval culture at this stage of the war. Iwabuchi, faced with conflicting orders from Army and Navy superiors, made the fateful decision to obey the Navy. His loyalty to his own service branch trumped the broader strategic vision articulated by Yamashita. He began gathering forces for the defense of Manila. The men who assembled under his command represented a motley and desperate collection of personnel. Sailors whose ships had been sunk now found themselves fighting as infantry, a role for which they had limited training. Marines, mechanics, and technical specialists were pressed into combat roles. The force even included Korean and Taiwanese auxiliary troops, as well as civilian workers who were given weapons and told to fight. The final count reached approximately 17,000 men, a substantial number, but one ill-suited for the conventional defense of a major city. The equipment situation proved even more problematic than the manpower issues. Iwabuchi's force lacked the fundamental tools of modern urban warfare. No tanks rumbled through Manila's streets under Japanese control. Heavy artillery, the kind that could engage in counter-battery fire against American guns, remained conspicuously absent. Even standard infantry weapons existed in insufficient quantities. Faced with these material deficiencies, Iwabuchi and his subordinates improvised with whatever resources they could scavenge. Aircraft that could no longer fly yielded nearly 1,000 20mm machine guns, weapons designed for air combat but now destined to be mounted in fixed positions throughout the city. Another 600 machine guns of various types were assembled from disparate sources. A handful of 120mm guns provided the only artillery support. Naval bombs, intended to be dropped from aircraft on enemy ships, were instead converted into improvised mines and explosive traps. Perhaps most poignantly, many defenders carried nothing more sophisticated than crude spears, fashioned by lashing bayonets to wooden poles, medieval weapons for a thoroughly modern war. Against this backdrop of desperate Japanese preparations, the American offensive machinery began to move. On the final day of January in 1945, MacArthur himself travelled to the forward command post of the 1st Cavalry Division, located at a place called Guimba. His presence at such a forward position underscored the importance he attached to the operation and the urgency he felt about reaching Manila. The orders he delivered were unambiguous. Advance immediately. Do not wait. Do not consolidate. Move now. Just after midnight, as January yielded to February, the so-called flying columns began their remarkable dash toward Manila. These were not cavalry in the traditional sense of horse-mounted soldiers, but rather fully motorized units capable of rapid movement along roads and through relatively open terrain. The distance they needed to cover exceeded 100 miles, and the route led through jungle and over mountain passes. Yet they accomplished this extraordinary march in just 66 hours of continuous movement, an achievement that would have been impossible for conventional infantry formations. By the 4th of February, the 1st Cavalry Division's lead elements had reached the outskirts of Manila itself. They were not alone. The 37th Infantry Division had also begun its own advance toward the city, moving to attack from a different direction. MacArthur, monitoring the progress of both divisions, established 3 immediate objectives that he considered paramount. First, the civilian internees held at Santo Tomas University must be liberated before the Japanese could harm them. Second, Malacañang Palace, the symbolic seat of Philippine government, must be secured. Third, the legislative building must be captured to establish the framework for restoring civil administration. Speed remained the watchword for all these operations. The liberation of Santo Tomas came swiftly, almost anticlimactically. On the night of February 3rd, troops from the 8th Cavalry Regiment approached the university compound. The gates stood closed, but not heavily defended. The guards, mostly Taiwanese auxiliary troops, offered virtually no resistance when confronted with American tanks and armed infantry. As the gates swung open and American soldiers poured into the compound, an extraordinary scene unfolded. Approximately 3,500 prisoners, predominantly Americans, but including British and Dutch civilians as well, had been confined in Santo Tomas since the Japanese occupation began in 1942. For 3 years they had endured privation, malnutrition, and the constant psychological pressure of captivity. Now, confronted with the sudden reality of liberation, many broke down entirely. Tears flowed freely. Prisoners embraced their liberators, touching uniforms to convince themselves this was not some cruel dream. The emotional scenes provided powerful propaganda images, but the situation remained complicated. 63 Japanese soldiers had barricaded themselves inside the main academic building, and they held 275 hostages. Tense negotiations stretched over the next 2 days. Finally, on February 5th, the last hostages emerged unharmed and the Japanese defenders either surrendered or committed suicide. The liberation created immediate logistical challenges. Thousands of malnourished civilians suddenly required food, medical care, and transportation. The American supply system, already stretched by the rapid advance, now had to accommodate this unexpected burden. Making matters worse, Japanese engineers had demolished the Novaliches bridges, which carried one of the main supply routes into the northern part of the city. American engineers would need time to construct replacement bridges, and in the meantime, supplies for the 1st Cavalry Division would have to be rationed carefully. As the Americans pushed deeper into Manila's northern districts, they encountered their first serious resistance. The Japanese had not fortified every building and street, but they had chosen key positions with care, creating strongpoints that could inflict maximum casualties on advancing American forces. The narrow streets of Manila, lined with substantial stone and concrete buildings, provided ideal defensive terrain. Japanese troops had buried mines at intersections and along main thoroughfares. Barbed wire blocked many passages. Abandoned trucks and automobiles, pushed into the streets, created obstacles that forced American vehicles to slow down or stop, making them vulnerable to fire from upper windows and rooftops. Machine gun positions had been carefully sited to create interlocking fields of fire, so that an American advance on one position would expose the attackers to fire from multiple other positions simultaneously. When the 148th Regiment attempted to cross the Estero de la Reina Bridge on their way to the Pasig River, they discovered just how thoroughly the Japanese had prepared. Mines had been buried in the approach roads. The bridge itself had been rigged with 5 massive 500-pound bombs, salvaged from Air Force stocks and wired for demolition. As American troops approached, fuel depots along the riverfront erupted in flames, whether from Japanese demolition or from stray gunfire remained unclear. Machine gun fire, disciplined and well-aimed, poured down on the advancing Americans from multiple positions. The Japanese Noguchi detachment had thoroughly prepared this sector. Buildings along the riverside had been systematically torched, both to create obstacles and to deny cover to American troops. Military facilities contained pre-positioned explosive charges. Faced with this determined resistance and the danger of the bridge demolitions, American commanders reluctantly ordered a temporary withdrawal while firefighting teams dealt with the blazes and engineers assessed the bridge situation. An unexpected complication arose from the Manila civilian population itself. Thousands of residents, recognizing American uniforms and vehicles, poured into the streets to celebrate their liberation. They brought gifts, offered food and drink, showered the soldiers with flowers and expressions of gratitude. The enthusiasm was genuine and understandable, but from a military perspective it created chaos. Streets became clogged with civilians at precisely the moments when military vehicles needed clear passage. Some civilians, whether from desperate need or opportunistic greed, began looting damaged buildings, particularly those that had belonged to Japanese concerns or to collaborators. This looting sometimes interfered with military operations, and American military police found themselves trying to maintain order among a population that had endured 3 years of harsh occupation and was now suddenly freed from that oppression. By February 7th, American forces had secured most of Manila north of the Pasig River. The river itself now became the new front line. The Japanese, recognizing they could not hold the northern districts against American firepower and numbers, had withdrawn across the river's several bridges. As they withdrew, they methodically destroyed every one of those bridges, denying the Americans easy access to the southern portions of the city. Lieutenant General Oscar Griswold, who commanded the 14th Corps overseeing the Manila operation, assessed the tactical situation and issued new orders. The 37th Division would expand its control eastward along the river, securing the northern bank. Meanwhile, the 1st Cavalry Division would execute a wide sweeping movement, circling around to the east and south to create an encirclement of the remaining Japanese forces. The river crossing began on February 7th. The 148th and 129th Regiments of the 37th Division prepared to assault across the Pasig, using whatever watercraft they could assemble. Engineers provided assault boats, and a few amphibious vehicles were available. The first wave of attackers crossed without incident, reaching the southern bank and establishing initial footholds. But the Japanese were merely waiting, holding their fire to draw more Americans into the kill zone. When the second wave pushed off from the northern bank, Japanese machine gunners opened fire with devastating effect. Bullets shredded the thin hulls of the assault boats. Oars splintered and broke. Soldiers, desperate to reach the relative safety of the southern bank, used whatever they could to propel their boats forward. Rifle butts served as improvised paddles. Some men simply used their hands, stroking frantically through water that frothed with the impact of machine gun bullets. Casualties mounted, but enough men reached the southern shore to establish a viable bridgehead. The landing site at Malacañang Gardens had been chosen with care. It represented the only significant stretch of riverbank that lacked the high embankments that characterized most of the Pasig's course through Manila. These embankments would have made it nearly impossible for heavily laden infantry to climb out of boats under fire. The gardens, by contrast, offered relatively gentle slopes that allowed the Americans to move inland quickly once they reached shore. Over the following hours, more and more troops crossed the river, reinforcing the bridgehead and beginning to push deeper into the southern districts. On February 8th, American engineers completed a remarkable feat of military engineering. Working under fire and against time constraints, they constructed a 2-lane pontoon bridge across the Pasig. The bridge represented a crucial logistics link, allowing vehicles and heavy equipment to cross the river without relying on the slow process of ferrying. But almost immediately, the bridge became clogged with civilian refugees. Hundreds of residents from the southern districts, terrified by the fighting and desperate to escape, surged onto the bridge, creating massive congestion that prevented military traffic from moving efficiently. American military police struggled to manage the flow, trying to balance humanitarian concerns with military necessity. Once across the river in strength, the 37th Division confronted an entirely different tactical environment. The southern districts of Manila contained a mix of industrial facilities and dense residential neighborhoods, all now turned into a defensive nightmare. The Japanese had transformed substantial buildings into miniature fortresses. On Provisor Island, an industrial zone near the river, stood a massive steam-powered electrical generating plant. Under normal circumstances, such a facility represented a target to be captured intact, preserving vital infrastructure for future use. But the Japanese had turned the power plant into a strongpoint that seemed almost impregnable. Sandbag bunkers surrounded the exterior. Machine gun positions had been established at every entrance and in every window. The interior, filled with the massive machinery of electrical generation, provided countless positions from which defenders could fire on attacking forces. American troops approached the power plant in assault boats, rowing through machine gun fire that churned the water around them. Those who reached the building's exterior had to fight their way inside through heavy steel doors. Once inside, the battle became a horrific close-quarters struggle in near darkness. The roar of generators, which the Japanese had left running, made verbal communication nearly impossible. Smoke from gunfire and from grenades filled the corridors and rooms. Japanese defenders, knowing every inch of the facility, would fire from concealed positions and then retreat deeper into the labyrinthine structure. American soldiers had to clear room by room, machine by machine, never certain whether the next door or the next piece of equipment concealed an enemy position. The fighting for the power plant consumed 2 entire days of brutal combat. 25 American soldiers died in the effort, and many more were wounded, but eventually the facility was secured. From the power plant, the 148th Regiment advanced through the Pandacan district, encountering surprisingly light resistance initially. But this proved to be merely the calm before another storm. At Paco railway station, the Americans ran into another heavily fortified position. The railway station, with its tracks, platforms, and associated buildings, had been transformed into what amounted to an urban fortress. 20mm guns, those salvaged from aircraft, had been positioned to cover every approach. Reinforced concrete bunkers protected the gun crews. Slit trenches crisscrossed the railway yard, allowing Japanese infantry to move under cover and to mass for counterattacks. Even the nearby church, with its bell tower rising above the surrounding buildings, had been incorporated into the defensive system, serving as an observation post from which Japanese spotters could direct fire onto American positions. The American infantry, faced with this strong point, had no choice but to advance slowly and methodically. They crawled forward yard by yard, using whatever cover they could find. Bazookas fired at the concrete bunkers, trying to blast holes through which grenades could be thrown. Covering fire from machine guns and rifles kept Japanese defenders suppressed while assault teams moved forward. The process was repeated again and again. 10 separate assaults were launched against different portions of the station complex. Each assault involved careful preparation, overwhelming fire support, and then a desperate dash across open ground to reach the next position. Clouds of dust and smoke obscured the battlefield. The air stank of cordite and death. Finally, at 8:45 on the morning of February 10th, the last Japanese defenders in Paco Station were eliminated and the position was declared secure. But the cost had been severe. 45 American soldiers had been killed in the 2 days of fighting for this single position. 307 more had been wounded, some of whom would succumb to their injuries in the coming days. The pattern established at Paco Station would repeat throughout the battle for southern Manila. Individual city blocks had been turned into mutually supporting fortresses. The Japanese had positioned their strong points with care, ensuring that an attack on one position would expose the attackers to fire from neighbouring positions. Initially, American artillery support remained limited. MacArthur, still hoping to preserve as much of Manila's infrastructure and architecture as possible, had issued orders restricting artillery fire to only those targets that had been positively identified and observed. Artillery could not simply bombard an entire city block on the suspicion that it might contain Japanese defenders. This restriction, while admirable in its intent to protect civilian lives and historic buildings, had the practical effect of increasing American casualties. Infantry had to assault prepared positions without the benefit of the devastating artillery preparation that had proven so effective in other battles. As casualties mounted and the slow, grinding nature of the urban battle became apparent, pressure increased to lift the artillery restrictions. On February 10th, MacArthur reluctantly agreed to modify his earlier orders. Henceforth, artillery could fire in support of infantry assaults without the previous restrictions. The change in policy had immediate and dramatic effects. American artillery doctrine emphasized massed fires, concentrating the shells from multiple guns on a single target to create overwhelming destructive power. Now, 105mm and 155mm howitzers positioned in the northern districts could fire across the river to support assaults in the south. Tanks moved forward to provide direct fire support at close range. Flamethrowers, terrifying weapons that sprayed ignited fuel into buildings and bunkers, became standard tools for clearing Japanese positions. The pattern became routine, though never easy. Artillery would blast a building, reducing it to rubble or at least creating breaches in its walls. Infantry would assault, often to be repulsed by surviving defenders. More artillery would follow, sometimes including phosphorus shells that burned fiercely and created choking smoke. Another assault would be launched. This process might repeat multiple times before a single building was finally cleared of defenders. The new police station on Marques de Comillas Street represented one of the most formidable Japanese strongpoints. The Japanese had not simply fortified the police headquarters itself, but had incorporated the entire surrounding complex into a single defensive bastion. A shoe factory, a social club, and a school all became parts of an interconnected fortress, with tunnels and passages allowing defenders to move between buildings without exposing themselves to American fire. The battle for this complex consumed 8 full days of continuous combat. Fresh American regiments had to be committed as the initial assault forces became exhausted and depleted. Tanks were brought forward for direct assault, their armor protecting them as they ground right up to the walls of buildings, their guns firing at point-blank range. Flamethrowers turned rooms into infernos. Phosphorus grenades created fires that could not be easily extinguished. Artillery shells rained down continuously. Gradually, building by building and room by room, the complex was reduced. The rubble that remained barely resembled the original structures. While the 37th Division ground forward through these urban battles, the 1st Cavalry Division executed its encirclement maneuver. On February 8th, the 8th and 5th Cavalry Regiments began crossing the Pasig River east and south of the main urban area. The 8th Cavalry took a more direct route, moving to cut off any Japanese retreat from the city. The 5th Cavalry swung in a wider arc, passing through the Makati district south of the main city. They encountered scattered resistance, small Japanese units that fought delaying actions, but could not hope to stop the American advance. On February 10th, the 5th Cavalry captured the Makati Power Station, another of the city's vital infrastructure facilities. The regiment's commander, following General Kruger's policy of preserving such installations whenever possible, ordered his men to take particular care in clearing the facility to minimize damage to the generating equipment. By February 12th, both cavalry regiments had reached the shores of Manila Bay, completing the encirclement of the city. The ring was now closed. No Japanese forces could escape to the south. The cavalry units then turned northward, advancing along the bay shore to link up with the 37th Division forces that were still grinding through the southern districts. Along their route of advance, they encountered additional strong points that required reduction. Harrison Park, which should have been a peaceful green space, had been turned into a defensive position with bunkers dug into the baseball fields and underneath the park's landscaping. Rizal Stadium, a sports facility, now housed machine gun nests and fighting positions. LaSalle University, an educational institution, had become a fortress. Each of these positions required the same methodical reduction. Flamethrowers burned out bunkers. Explosives collapsed defensive positions. Tanks provided supporting fire. Gradually, inexorably, the cavalry regiments advanced. On February 16th, the 1st Cavalry Brigade, comprising the 5th and 12th Cavalry Regiments, received new orders. They were detached from the division's encirclement operations and ordered to reinforce the 37th Division in the downtown area, where the fighting had reached a new level of intensity. The targets now included some of Manila's most prominent buildings. The Manila Hotel, a luxury establishment that had hosted international travelers in peacetime, now contained Japanese defenders who had fortified every floor. MacArthur's former residence, the High Commissioner's quarters, a building with personal significance for the general, also required assault. The fighting proceeded room by room, floor by floor. MacArthur himself, in a dramatic gesture, appeared in the rubble-strewn streets to encourage his troops, demonstrating the importance he attached to these symbolic buildings. In the northern sectors, the 37th Division had already largely cleared Japanese resistance. On February 19th, the exhausted 148th Regiment, which had borne the brunt of the fighting for weeks, was finally relieved by the 5th Cavalry. The cavalry regiment immediately found itself thrust into another brutal battle, this time for the University of the Philippines Hospital. The hospital complex should have been sacrosanct under the laws of war, protected as a medical facility. But the Japanese had turned it into yet another strong point. Bunkers had been dug into the grounds. Loopholes had been cut into basement walls and rooftop parapets. The defenders had created interlocking fields of fire throughout the complex. The fact that thousands of patients and civilians sheltered inside the buildings complicated the American assault. Artillery could not simply flatten the hospital. Infantry had to clear it carefully, trying to minimize civilian casualties while eliminating Japanese defenders. The battle dragged on for days. Of the approximately 250 Japanese defenders initially in the hospital, only 75 remained alive by the night of February 23rd. Rather than surrender, these survivors committed suicide en masse, using grenades to kill themselves in a final act of desperate loyalty to their emperor and their code. The Americans, pushing through the aftermath, found and rescued more than 7,000 patients and civilians who had been trapped throughout the fighting. With the outer ring of the city secured and most of the southern districts either cleared or reduced to rubble, the final Japanese holdouts concentrated in Intramuros, the old walled city that represented the historic heart of Manila. The Spanish colonial government, centuries earlier, had built Intramuros as a fortress, surrounding it with massive stone walls that rose 40 feet high and stretched several feet thick. These walls, designed to resist cannon fire from the era of sailing ships, now faced 20th-century American artillery. From February 17th onward, American heavy guns subjected Intramuros to continuous bombardment. The psychological impact on the Japanese defenders inside must have been tremendous. There could be no doubt about the eventual outcome. The walls might be thick, but they could not withstand indefinite pounding from modern artillery. Yet the defenders showed no signs of surrender. They simply waited behind their walls, preparing for the inevitable assault. By the morning of February 23rd, American artillery had fired more than 7,400 shells at Intramuros. The bombardment included 105mm and 155mm howitzer shells, 75mm shells from pack howitzers that had been brought forward, 4.2-inch mortar rounds, and even 8-inch gun shells, massive projectiles that created enormous explosions. Finally, a gap appeared in the eastern wall, a breach wide enough for infantry to assault through. 10 minutes after the artillery barrage ceased, smoke generators laid down a thick screen to obscure the assault forces from any surviving Japanese observers. The 129th Regiment, positioned along the Pasig River north of Intramuros, crossed in engineer boats to attack the northern portions of the walled city. Simultaneously, the 145th Regiment prepared to assault through the breach in the eastern wall. The artillery preparation had been devastatingly effective. Many of the Japanese machine gun positions had been destroyed or buried in rubble. The surviving defenders, dazed and disoriented from days of continuous bombardment, offered less resistance than might have been expected. American infantry advanced rapidly through the breached wall and into the narrow streets of Intramuros. But then they encountered an unexpected complication. Thousands of civilians, refugees who had sought shelter within the old walls, now surged into the streets. More than 2,000 women and children, many of whom had been herded into the Delmonico church by Japanese soldiers, had not yet been evacuated. American supply troops rushed forward with trucks, trying to transport these refugees to safety before they could be caught in the continuing combat. The men, however, faced a different fate. Japanese defenders separated them from the women and children and marched them toward Fort Santiago. There, in acts of cold-blooded murder, they were executed en masse, gunned down or bayoneted in what amounted to a final atrocity. Inside Intramuros, the 129th and 145th Regiments advanced street by street through the ancient district. Every narrow lane presented potential ambush sites. Japanese defenders had dug foxholes and dugouts throughout the area. Booby traps had been placed in doorways and at intersections. In the northwest corner of Intramuros stood Fort Santiago, a structure with deep historical significance. During the Spanish colonial period, it had served as a prison, and the Philippine national hero José Rizal had been confined there before his execution. Now, under Japanese control, it had been transformed into a dark labyrinth of cells, tunnels, and underground passages. American troops approaching the fort faced the challenge of clearing a structure that had been designed specifically to resist assault. Conventional tactics proved insufficient. Instead, the Americans resorted to desperate measures. They poured gasoline and oil through ventilation shafts, then ignited it with phosphorus grenades. Flames licked through the tunnels and passages. Smoke, thick and acrid, filled every chamber. Flamethrower teams moved carefully through the smoke, spraying fire into any opening or doorway that might conceal defenders. The ancient mossy stone walls, which had stood for centuries, now witnessed horrors that would have been unimaginable to their Spanish builders. After hours of this brutal clearing operation, American troops reported Fort Santiago secured by midday on February 25th. But the Japanese defenders, even in their final extremity, proved capable of deception and treachery. Some dressed themselves in American uniforms that had been captured or scavenged, and armed themselves with M1 rifles taken from American dead. They attempted to infiltrate American positions or to create confusion during assaults. Others raised white flags from the windows of the Delmonico church, suggesting surrender. When American soldiers approached to accept that surrender, they were met with grenades and machine gun fire. The church itself became a scene of fierce fighting. By the time it was finally cleared, several hundred Japanese bodies lay among the pews and in the church's underground areas. Even as Intramuros fell, pockets of Japanese resistance remained in several major government buildings in the southern part of the city. The Legislative Building, the Finance Building, and the Agriculture Building formed a triangle of strongpoints that Iwabuchi had heavily reinforced in anticipation of the final American assault. These were large, modern structures built of reinforced concrete, and the Japanese had prepared them with particular care. Machine guns covered every window. Basements had been converted into bunkers with sandbag walls and interlocking firing positions. The upper floors provided observation points from which Japanese spotters could direct fire onto American positions. On February 25th, the 37th Division's artillery began a systematic bombardment of these government buildings. However, some of the shells overshot their intended targets and fell among 1st Cavalry Division positions near Manila Bay, causing casualties and forcing a temporary halt to adjust the fire. On February 26th, properly coordinated, the bombardment resumed, and the 148th Regiment launched its assault on the Legislative Building. But the Japanese defenders had prepared thoroughly. They had cut holes in the floors between levels, allowing them to throw grenades down onto American soldiers advancing through the lower floors. This forced the infantry to withdraw, while artillery fired another preparatory barrage. It was not until February 28th that the legislative building finally fell to American control. Meanwhile, the 5th Cavalry Regiment assaulted the agriculture building, but found themselves pinned down by fire from an unexpected direction. The nearby San Luis Terrace apartments, which had not been identified as a major strongpoint, turned out to house Japanese defenders who could fire directly onto troops approaching the agriculture building. The cavalry had to clear the apartments first, a task that consumed hours of close-quarters combat before they could return their attention to the primary objective. On February 28th, American 155mm guns were brought forward to fire at point-blank range at the agriculture building. Tanks ground forward until they were literally touching the structure's base, their guns elevated to fire upward into the lower floors. The concentrated fire blasted holes in the reinforced concrete, creating breaches through which infantry could assault. Flamethrowers, bazookas, and phosphorus grenades completed the work of destruction. On March 1st, American officers called for the Japanese defenders to surrender, allowing them time to consider the hopelessness of their situation. The only response was silence. The bombardment resumed. Fuel was poured into the building and ignited. Explosives were placed at strategic points and detonated, bringing down portions of the structure. 2 days later, after yet another massive artillery barrage, the 148th Regiment stormed the finance building, the last major Japanese strongpoint. The defenders fought literally to the last man, with the final Japanese soldiers holed up in an elevator shaft. By dawn on March 3rd, they too had been eliminated. That afternoon, General Griswold composed a message to General Kruger, his superior officer. The message was brief and to the point. All organized resistance in Manila has ended. The Battle of Manila was officially over. American flags were raised over government buildings. Soldiers, exhausted after a month of continuous urban combat, finally allowed themselves to believe they might survive. But even as the military situation resolved itself, the true horror of those 3 weeks became fully apparent. The atrocities committed by Japanese forces, particularly by Iwabuchi's naval troops, had been systematic and extensive. These were not random acts of violence born from combat stress, but deliberate massacres carried out with cold calculation. As American forces had advanced through the city, Japanese defenders had taken out their fury and frustration on Manila's civilian population. Entire districts had been put to the torch. Tondo, Binondo, and Paco, all densely populated residential neighborhoods, had seen buildings systematically burned with civilians still inside. Women and children had been herded into churches, schools, and other large buildings, then killed en masse, either burned alive or blown apart with grenades and explosives. Men had been separated from their families and executed in courtyards, backyards, and garbage pits, their bodies left to rot or thrown into the Pasig River. The diaries and testimonies of survivors painted a picture of unimaginable horror. At the Bayview Hotel, families had been gathered together, and then Japanese soldiers had systematically raped women and girls before murdering them. At various Catholic churches throughout the city, congregations had been locked inside and the buildings set ablaze. At St. Paul's School, hundreds had been burned alive when the Japanese ignited fuel throughout the building. Some civilians had survived by crawling into sewers, pushing their children through narrow storm drains to escape the flames and bullets above. Parents had made impossible choices about which children to save when there was only room for 1 or 2 to squeeze through an opening. The Quirino family, relatives of politician Manuel Roxas, who would later become Philippine president, had suffered particularly tragic losses. Japanese soldiers had murdered members of Roxas's wife's family, including children, while Roxas himself was forced to listen to their screams, unable to help. A witness named Lourdes Reyes later testified about seeing civilians dragged to the river's edge, their throats cut, and their bodies pushed into the current to float downstream. The catalogue of atrocities seemed endless. Complicating the civilian casualty question was the role of American artillery. While most civilian deaths could be directly attributed to Japanese massacres, the American bombardment, particularly after the restrictions were lifted on February 10th, had also taken a terrible toll. Civilians trapped in air raid shelters had been killed when shells collapsed buildings above them or when secondary fires spread. Some shelters had become furnaces as fires raged outside, asphyxiating or incinerating those who had sought protection within. American commanders wrestled with the moral calculus of using heavy artillery in urban areas, balancing the lives of their own soldiers against the lives of civilians caught in the crossfire. When the final accounting was attempted, the numbers defied comprehension. American casualties totaled 1,010 dead, a significant loss but relatively modest considering the intensity of the fighting. Japanese losses were catastrophic, with 16,665 confirmed dead and virtually the entire garrison annihilated. But the civilian death toll overshadowed all military casualties. 100,000 lives lost, making Manila one of the worst urban catastrophes of the entire Second World War. Only Warsaw and possibly Leningrad exceeded Manila in terms of civilian suffering during urban combat. The physical destruction of the city matched the human tragedy. The American artillery that had protected soldiers from having to face machine guns at close range had also reduced much of Intramuros to rubble. Centuries of Spanish colonial architecture, churches that had stood since the 1600s, government buildings that represented Philippine history and culture, all had been reduced to debris. The city's infrastructure lay in ruins. Water systems had been destroyed. Electrical generation and distribution facilities, despite efforts to preserve some, had been extensively damaged. Transportation networks, the roads and bridges and rail lines that allowed a modern city to function, would require months or years to fully restore. Hospitals, schools, universities, and entire residential neighborhoods existed only as shattered remnants of their former selves. In the immediate aftermath of the battle's end, American forces found themselves transitioning from combat operations to occupation and administration duties. Engineers worked around the clock to construct temporary bridges to replace those demolished during the fighting. Teams of soldiers carefully cleared mines from streets and buildings, dangerous work that claimed additional lives even after the shooting stopped. Military police posted guards to prevent looting, though the temptation proved irresistible for many of Manila's desperate residents. The American soldiers themselves, though victorious, faced the grim reality of occupation duty in a city scarred by disease, destruction, and haunting memories. Military authorities attempted to maintain morale by organizing film showings, dances with Red Cross volunteers, and ensuring that hot meals reached the troops. But no amount of entertainment could erase the sights and smells of what they had witnessed. From a purely military perspective, the Battle of Manila provided valuable lessons about combined arms warfare in urban terrain. Even without effective air power inside the city itself, American forces had demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of artillery, armor, and infantry working in careful coordination. The initial restrictions on artillery use had resulted in higher casualties among infantry units forced to assault prepared positions without adequate fire support. Once those restrictions were lifted and American doctrine was allowed to work as designed, casualties declined markedly. Statistics showed that American deaths averaged 26 per day during the initial phase of cautious operations, but dropped to just 6 per day by the end of February once artillery was employed without restriction. The Japanese forces had faced an impossible task from the beginning. They lacked artillery to engage in counter-battery fire. They had no tanks to counter American armor. Their communications systems had been primitive and easily disrupted. Air support, which had once been a strength of Japanese military operations, no longer existed. All Iwabuchi and his men had possessed was willpower and the city itself. They had used both to maximum effect. Foxholes dug into street surfaces, mines carefully placed in stairwells and doorways, machine guns firing from carefully selected windows, and an absolute determination to fight to the death in every room of every building. These had been their weapons. But sheer determination, no matter how fanatical, could not withstand the overwhelming material superiority of American forces. When one side possessed unlimited artillery ammunition, flamethrowers, tanks, explosives, and fresh troops to replace casualties, the outcome was never truly in doubt. The only questions were how long it would take and how many would die in the process. The Battle of Manila held the distinction of being the first and only time during the Pacific War that United States forces had to conduct a major assault on a large urban area. The island battles at Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa had involved brutal fighting, but those were not battles for cities in the true sense. Manila, with its hundreds of thousands of residents, its complex infrastructure, and its historical significance, presented unique challenges. The liberation of the city paved the way for the eventual reconquest of all of Luzon and the re-establishment of Philippine sovereignty. But it also exposed the brutal arithmetic of urban warfare. When combat enters a city, when the front lines run down residential streets and through family homes, every building can become a fortress and every family can become a victim. The firestorm of Manila in 1945 consumed not only the city's ancient walls and modern buildings, but also something less tangible but equally important. It consumed the memory of an entire generation, burning into the consciousness of survivors images and experiences that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. For the Filipinos who endured the battle, whether as combatants in the resistance, as civilians caught between the armies, or as prisoners waiting desperately for liberation, Manila became a synonym for horror. For the American soldiers who fought there, it represented urban warfare at its most intense and unforgiving. For the Japanese defenders, it became a tomb, a final resting place where they enacted their code of death before dishonor. In the decades since, historians and military analysts have studied the Battle of Manila extensively, drawing lessons about urban combat, civilian protection, and the moral complexities of modern warfare. The battle stands as a warning to posterity about what happens when war enters cities. The unparalleled devastation, the massive civilian casualties, the destruction of irreplaceable cultural heritage, all serve as reminders that urban warfare represents a particularly catastrophic form of combat. The lesson is clear. Peace must be cherished and protected at all costs, for once war enters a city's streets, once artillery begins to fall on residential neighborhoods and soldiers fight room to room through family homes, the costs become almost incomprehensible. Manila in 1945 demonstrated these truths with a clarity that demands remembrance. The 100,000 civilians who died, the soldiers on all sides who perished in the ruins, the city itself reduced to rubble, all testify to the fundamental truth that modern warfare and urban civilian populations cannot coexist without catastrophic consequences. This is the legacy of Manila, a warning etched in fire and blood into the history of the 20th century, a reminder that must never be forgotten lest the horrors be repeated in some future conflict.